Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. It's been a while since I've featured some Alliance Conquest footage in my videos. I've been gathering up all my testing and decided to include them with this tier list video. By doing this, I'm hoping to make the video a little bit more interesting than me just going through a list, where I can actually show you the results that I got from the testing that I did to give you a better idea of why I put characters in certain parts of the tier list. I'm also doing a crystal coupon giveaway, so if you want to be eligible for that, make sure that you either have the Line or Discord app and are also in my Discord channel, and simply leave your name, that's either for Line or Discord, in the comments section down below. Also, if you want to reference the tier lists yourself in the future, the link is in the description for this video. Anyways, starting off from the top, Thanos' upgrade has now put him in the top spot in terms of the Alliance Conquest tier list. The character can basically take out any other opponent in the game and is tanky enough with the proper supports to be able to block off or hold off other opponents from certain zones. Without supports, he isn't really too tanky, but because he has the leadership now that gives him extra defense and attack, and has that debuff, you have the opportunity to do a double support for him. And even without the supports, he should be able to tackle pretty much any other opponent in the game relatively easily. So you're probably already aware of how good the character is in this mode by now. Here are two clips that I included just to show you that as a solo character, he is capable of taking out some top metas pretty easily, I would say. And since characters like this and Warlock are so good, then I'm not really going to be showing what they're capable of as much as I'm going to be showing what characters you can use to counter them, and possibly what teams you can use them for. But you can see here, even without top supports like Colossus and Hela, my Thanos is able to solo the previously top AC team by himself. In terms of counters that you can use, Thanos without supports like Colossus or Hela isn't actually too difficult to take down, so you have many options. There's too many characters to list when Thanos is fought without those supports, but when he does have those supports, he actually becomes a very tanky and a credible threat. So as you can see, one of the characters that I use to counter him is Makari, because she goes quickly into her third skill and it can lock down Thanos, but also does a huge amount of damage and takes him out relatively quickly before he can get going and counter or one-shot my team. Another good counter is Crescent with her own leadership and Wasp with a support or with another good second character. She'll go into her fifth skill right away, which can basically one-shot him even when she doesn't have a damage proc. Spidey is also a solid counter due to his passive that gives him extra damage versus villains and the fact that he can ignore the damage reduction. Thanos can potentially one-shot him, so it's usually a good idea to include him with another strong leader character like Sentry or Silver Surfer. The second character on the list is Adam Warlock now. He isn't exactly number one because he is a blast type, so he is susceptible to a lot of the speed types that have been buffed up with recent patches. Regardless of this, his kit is stacked. He has really high burst damage because of that second skill, iframe ignore counter, and he has really good survival with those two lives. His fifth skill can basically lock down opponents that don't have debuff or their debuff is down, and his damage is so high that even without a damage proc, he is capable of taking out speed types too. Just to give you an idea of how good the character is, I usually do my solo test to see how well the character can perform by themselves, so that usually consists of one debuff leadership and a semi-average support like Victorious or Red She-Hulk that basically just gives you some extra health. For characters like Warlock and other top tier characters or ones in the highest tier, it doesn't really matter too much what kind of build you're running on them because they perform so consistently by themselves. This is even truer for Warlock because he has that guard break immunity built into his uniform or passive, I believe, so you can basically use any kind of CTP that you want on him. I'm running a regen on him because I generally prefer tankier meta characters, but some players do like using the damage proc on him because he usually opens with his second skill and can potentially one-shot the entire team right away. If you've faced this character or have him yourself, at this point you're probably already aware of just how good he is, but for consistency's sake, here is me taking down the previous top Alliance team composition with just a solo Warlock. Similar to Thanos, he's able to solo this team, which is one of the reasons why he is at the top of the list. You can see that I was running Molecule Man with Warlock most often. This is kind of my go-to team with him, and I found that the most consistent third character without making the team way too overkill or very heavy is Shang-Chi. The reason for that is because the opponent will likely use a speed type to counter Warlock, and Shang-Chi obviously has the combat type benefit versus them, but he also has that iframe ignore and reflect, which makes him very versatile versus the opponents that are used versus Warlock. There's plenty of meta characters and speed types that can potentially counter Warlock, but similar to Thanos, the character that I found most consistent was Makari, simply because she can go into her skills very quickly and take out Warlock before he really starts to get going. Spider-Man is also a really good counter, I would say even more so than Makari because of his iframe ignore and because he also iframes a lot. And similar to the Thanos counter team that I mentioned earlier, using a strong leadership like Sentry or Silver Surfer will make that team an even more guaranteed win. So Thanos and Warlock now dominate the top of the meta, or the walls that I called. So again, are the characters that are difficult to take down. But following that, we have a lot of great additions to the upper meta, or what I call solos, which are characters that can basically solo top characters, either with supports or without, but are a little less durable or are a little bit easier to take down. At the very top of the upper meta, at least for the speed types, is Electro. He's actually really good for multiple reasons. He has a good leadership that you can use with something like Wasp or even without it. He has a support passive for himself and other characters that deal lightning damage. He has good survival. He has high burst damage, and he also has iframe ignore. Dr. Octopus was also in the same update as Electro, but due to his lack of iframe ignore, he is a little bit lower on the list in the lower meta or busters, because he usually requires one other good character in order to support him. Not necessarily a support, just another good strong character to pair up with him. The reason that I'm mentioning him now instead of the higher tier characters is because I often paired him with Electro due to Electro having the benefit to Sinister 6 characters, and because obviously Dr. Octopus has the Sinister 6 tag. One thing that's really good about the upgrade for Dr. Octopus is that he has much higher base damage now, so if you run something like a damage proc with him, he often goes into his 5th or 4th skill fairly quickly, and that can potentially one-shot the opponent if you have, again, good supports or a damage proc. Here is the team that I was talking about. So I'm running Electro for his leadership and his own damage, and pairing him with Dr. Octopus because he gets that support, and using Wasp as the debuff passive. You can get an idea of just how well this team works because my Electro with a regen and my Doc Ock with a CTP of Destruction is able to quickly take down a Thanos team. You can also note that Electro is doing much of the heavy lifting because after Doc Ock does his 5th or 4th skill, he'll usually end up dying because he doesn't have too much survival in his kit. So Electro is basically left to solo the rest of the team. To give you a better idea of just how good Electro is, here he is again, this time with no Doc Ock and basically just supports and even no debuff leadership, and he's able to take down a Thanos set by himself with relative ease, I would say. I placed Hawkeye right after Electro because even though he is really good now, he does have the iframe ignore counter, pretty good survival, and the flexibility to be built with pretty much any kind of CTP because he has the guard break immunity built in. But despite that, his damage is a little bit slow, so the opponent can potentially take him out before he ever really deals any damage from his 5th or his iframe counter or his 4th. I did my usual solo test with him with the debuff lead and a decent support, and took him up against a pretty decent composition, having a Null, Quasar, and a Heimdall, which can be pretty tanky considering that Heimdall has that bubble shield. And Null also has that immortality passive, with Quasar and Null both having that debuff passive. If you noticed in the first clip, and you'll probably notice in this one, Hawkeye ended up at half health, which is often the case because, like I said, his 5th skill is kind of slow to deal damage. This is also why I would recommend running something like an Authority, Transcendence, or Regen, since he likely won't be able to do the damage from a damage proc in time before he dies. I put Deadpool under Hawkeye because even though he is better now, he is also kind of slow to get his damage going. Usually has to wait till after his 5th skill is fully cast, and afterwards he usually goes into his 4th skill, which with this new uniform makes him a little bit more susceptible to dying because it is not a full iframe. However, despite that, his burst damage is much better with the new uniform, which will allow you to take down some of the higher metas on the list. Even though I'm using some pretty good characters for the solo test, they do end up dying relatively quickly, so you are left to see what Deadpool can do by himself. His base damage and burst damage is much better now, and that's evident because he was able to take down an Apocalypse, which obviously has the type advantage versus him. I found this uniform to be more consistent versus the Mephisto and Dormammu combos because Deadpool doesn't linger in his 5th skill or 4th skill iframe for too long, giving either of the opponent characters enough time to go into their iframe ignore, which will end up usually taking out Deadpool either through Dormammu's Reflect or Mephisto's 4th skill after he has knocked Deadpool out of his iframe. You saw in the last clip that I used the more traditional solo team with Thane's leadership and Victorious' support, which highlights just how effective Deadpool is as a solo character. However, in this one, I'm using Strife and Vision again because that is my go-to team with Deadpool that I found works really well all around. It does work pretty well and would work even better if Strife got a T3, but for the most part, it usually lowers the opponent's health down enough for Deadpool to finish them off, or from Vision's Reflect to do the same. But regardless, if they die, you can see that Deadpool can carry his own weight. Following Deadpool is Kate Bishop, but I have to note that she is only up here at this level if you have her artifact that gives her the iframe ignore. If you don't have access to that, then she is much lower on the list. With her new uniform, her base damage is really good, including her burst damage, and she also has really strong lockdown or CC because she usually opens with her 4th skill, which has the paralysis on it. So if the opponent doesn't have a debuff leadership or support, then they will get locked down and potentially burst it down very quickly. In this first clip, I take her versus a Thanos and a Jean, and you can see that with the artifact and that 4th skill CC and burst damage, she's able to make very quick work of them. I run a CTP of Authority on her myself because I usually want her to survive long enough for that artifact that provides her iframe ignore to any of her skills to activate. Despite that, it does seem to activate pretty consistently at the beginning, so you could potentially pair her up with a damage proc. I also forgot to mention that one of the reasons why I put Kate under Deadpool is because Deadpool has his own iframe ignore in his kit, whereas Kate has it dependent on her artifact, which means that she doesn't have access to it all the time. For a similar reason, Maya Lopez or Echo's uniform is right under Kate because she doesn't have an iframe ignore at all. But regardless of that, she does have an amazing leadership with the self debuff and the damage and defense increase. She also has that support passive with the ignore dodge to her team, and she has pretty good survival as well with healing on at least 2 skills and some pretty decent length iframe skills on top of that. In this clip, I'm basically using Maya as a solo character since Mystique and Wave die right away, and you can see that her survival is fairly good because I am using a CTP of Greed, and she basically takes very little damage. Ideally, you won't run the character solo. It's best to obviously run it with other good speed types, so in this test, I'm using just Echo or Maya with Kate, and you can see that they're strong enough to take down a Thanos set with Hela as a support. Because Maya gives you the flexibility of having a damage increase and a support on the team as well as a debuff, you can potentially run 3 speed characters as well, which actually works pretty effectively. As you can see here, I was able to take down 3 top metas simply using some of the great new additions, being Kate, Maya, and Hawkeye. With that said, my go-to team with Maya is using Makari because of her very quick burst damage, which gets even better with Maya's lead and support, and Kate to provide that quick iframe ignore and CC burst damage as well. A full speed team with top speed metas and Maya is actually pretty formidable, and you might want to consider some possible counters to them, since an all-combat team might still struggle versus them considering the high base damage that these characters can have. Using the Defenders or Black Dwarf as a leadership is a pretty good counter, but I tend to like using this team because it has fail-safes in case the burst damage takes out my team fairly quickly. Corvus can revive and burst down the opponent team, and Mr. Sinister has that immortal artifact, which allows him to continue doing damage to the other team. Ultron is one character that's actually pretty solid in Alliance Conquest, but got a little bit overshadowed with Thanos dropping at the same time as him. A lot of us hoped that he would get a native tier 3 status with his uniform and the benefits that come with it, but even though he doesn't get that, the artifact gives him the iframe ignore, similar to Kate, and if you are running a damage proc on him, he can basically one-shot any character in the game. He isn't as high up on the solos or upper tier of the meta tier list because there are so many good universal type characters that compete versus him and have a lot more in their kit, making them more consistent. For those that don't really know how he does and haven't really built him up too well, here is the typical solo test that I run him with. So I'm actually using a better support, Colossus, for a little bit added survival, and I'm using Wasp for the debuff so that I can use Ultron's own leadership. As you see with the destruction build, I'm able to take out every opponent and barely lose any health. For consistency, here is another test, but this time using War Machine as a support to gain that little bit of extra health, defense, and damage. And if you note the artifact icon in the top left corner, every time the fight starts, Ultron usually opens with his 4th skill and almost immediately procs that artifact, which works very well with a damage proc on top of that. He functions very similarly to Kate, with that iframe ignore artifact and really good burst damage, but versus some of the higher metas, even if you build survival based, you might struggle versus them, especially ones that have reflect and iframe ignore. As you can see from these clips now, Ultron has the capability of one-shotting pretty strong characters like Thanos, Emma, and Warlock, but characters that have extra survival, such as with the immortality artifact, will give him some trouble. Moving on to the lower meta, these are characters that I call busters because they are characters that can take out some higher tier meta characters, but usually require the assistance of another good character, which doesn't necessarily have to be a support, and most often isn't. I mentioned Dr. Octopus earlier in this video, and he falls within this category, but one character that performs more consistently than him because he has more survival in his tools and kit is Drax. Although Drax doesn't have as much damage as Dr. Octopus, he does have a lot of things in his kit that not only give him more survival, but allow him to ramp up damage, that being his artifact and the taunt mechanic. Because Drax doesn't fall into the higher categories of the tier list, naturally I didn't take him up versus some of the top tier teams, but as you can see here from this solo test, I was able to take down Deadpool with his old uniform and Spider-Man, which himself is in the higher tiers. It did take till the Awakening skill was activated to get that iframe ignore, but nevertheless you can see that his survival allows him to be able to do that. Although this zone was strafed and weakened, I did take him as a solo versus Hulk and Silver Surfer to see if he could survive both of Silver Surfer's lives and the reflect, as well as Hulk's healing and iframe ignore. Now the character can do pretty decently by himself like you saw, but versus some of the higher tier teams in Alliance Conquest, he will struggle solo. This is why the character is best used with other strong characters to assist him, allowing him to take out some of those stronger teams that he couldn't by himself. This clip highlights exactly what I mean, since his leadership boosts up the survival of the other characters, and his taunt mechanic basically allows them to do more damage as well. The last character that falls into this category is Gwenpool. She has really high base damage that can potentially allow her to one-shot with no damage proc, but her survival does struggle a little bit because her healing is much more reduced than Deadpool's. She doesn't have the iframe ignore like Deadpool either, but despite that, she has some potential to take out some top meta characters, which is the reason she falls into the lower meta or busters category. So I included 2 example clips of this, with her being in a solo team and being able to take out characters like Jean with the 2 lives, and Mr. Sinister with his immortal artifact. Again, even though she doesn't have the iframe ignore to allow her to push a little bit higher in the tier list, her survival is decent enough with her own iframes to be able to take out characters like this. However, versus some other meta characters that have revive or immortality and the iframe ignore effect, she will struggle versus them because her iframes won't allow her to stay alive long enough to take out their second life. You can try to mitigate this by using either a regen or an authority like I did, but it can only help you so much. Gamora then falls 1 tier lower than the others because she is a little bit less consistent. The way that the borderline tier of the tier list is defined is that these characters are ones that you wouldn't necessarily revive in between phases of Alliance Conquest, since you mainly want to focus your tokens on the characters that are meta or most consistent. Besides this, these are characters that can even struggle versus characters that are not considered meta. I obviously took her into the standard solo testing that I do, but I wasn't able to take out some of the stronger teams that you saw with the previous character tests. She obviously does have some capability of taking out the lower meta teams, or possibly 1 or 2 of the higher meta characters, but these are usually on teams that aren't very strong. You can see a prime example of that in this clip where I take out one of the really old Jean Thanos teams from before, but versus some of the stronger teams like the Mephisto Dormammu that you saw versus Gwenpool, she does struggle. Mysterio got bumped up to the borderline or A tier category with this most recent update, specifically because he was kind of decent before with his survival due to the many iframes, and because of the stat bump, he now can survive longer, allowing him to go into his awakening skill to take out some of the stronger opponents. As it is, his kit is a little bit dated, and he doesn't really do that much damage, and most of his damage is pretty delayed, meaning that opponents that do have iframe ignore can take him out fairly quickly. I didn't really record too many solo tests with him, but one team that I find worked pretty well for him was using Black Cat's lead, and then balancing the team with Miles's Carnage-like uniform to give you that speed blast combat balance. The last character that I have testing clips for is Green Goblin. He fell into the B tier, or ones that are missing something, because he still doesn't have his awakening or his T3 skill. Even though he is missing those, his performance at T2 is actually pretty good, and because he does have that leadership and support passive, he can be pretty effective for other teams to make them stronger. Because he's so dominant in PvE, I used a CTP of Destruction, and you can see his survival versus the Mephisto Dormammu combo. He can survive pretty much into their second life, and although he might not necessarily be doing the main damage in this team, it does really boost up Proxima, and when Wu's leadership does add a lot of survival to both Proxima and Green Goblin. He does have some decent duration iframes, and he goes into them pretty early, which is one of the reasons why you'll see him survive into the middle of particular fights, especially versus opponents with 2 lives or a revive. The final characters on the tier list are Sandman and Vulture, and they haven't really moved too much in the tier list because they haven't really gotten anything. They've simply gotten an awakening, but their base kit is very lacking, so they really need a new uniform in order to jump up to the higher tiers. Anyways, that does it for the current tier list. Sorry the video got so long, but there was a lot of content to cover. The next update is almost upon us, so I have updated the artifact and PvP tier list as well. Basically, the only thing that changed in the PvP tier list is that Thanos is now second from the top, followed by Warlock. Sentry is still at the very top because he is a character that can basically take out any opponent in the game, and he has the benefit of having 2 lives with his revive. If you want to see these tier lists or other game guides for yourself, you can find a link in the video description. Also, don't forget, if you want to be eligible for the crystal coupon giveaways, you need to have either the Discord or Line app, and leave a comment in the video stating what your Line tag or your Discord tag is, so that I can send you the crystal coupon to that tag. Just keep in mind that if you do leave your Discord tag, you do have to be part of my Discord channel, otherwise I won't be able to contact you. If you want to join the Discord, there is a link in the video description for that as well. Anyways, thank you for your time and watching. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please consider sharing it, liking, and subscribing. And as always, thank you for your time and watching, but the video is now over.